Galbo, who's in Winnipeg right now in the Center for Social Justice, for actually initiating this, and Kevin for pulling it off in a masterful way and really making it into a space where we could discuss the contradictions of trying to deal with the pension issue for workers, not just the attacks on workers, but where do workers go with this stuff. So today we want to address the financialization and its relationship to pensions, if pensions haven't become such a major player in financial markets, and the question of labor and labor's integration into finance. We're going to start with John Peters from Laurentian University in Sudbury. John teaches there and is also a community and union activist. John's going to focus more on talking about financialization itself and then generally how it affects the economy and the labor movement.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam, and thanks, Kevin, for inviting me and for providing the sort of background for the series and overseeing the series on pensions and finance. I think it's a tremendously important topic, and I think it's something that really strikes at the center of many major sort of labor union issues these days, about how to deal with finance, how to deal with these huge economic questions when you yourself are implicated in these huge kinds of financial changes that have taken place, and moreover how to address the kinds of imbalances of economic power that are increasingly sort of constraining labor movements as well as progressive movements, I think, in North America and Western Europe. And I think just to sort of give sort of a narrative to sort of my thinking about this, and that's the best I can do because it is a huge kind of topic. I guess I initially began to sort of really think about financialization and what it meant to the economy and to business and to labor, I think after the financial crisis with everybody else. And it really began with the massive kinds of protests that were taking place across Western Europe and later on in New York. And I was in Madrid in June 2009 when the indigenous and as well as these major sort of popular and massive protests were taking place and initially began to take place. And this is in downtown Madrid at what's called the Plaza del Sol. And at that time, hundreds, certainly in some cases on different evenings, thousands of students were just living in the square all throughout the summer. And in Spain already by that time, unemployment had hit about 15%, and youth unemployment was 40% at that time, and it's still around 40 to 50%. And massive protests were taking place on at least a weekly basis, and this was one of the weekends when we were there and we took this shot. And people were protesting about finance and the fact, of course, that they were thrown out of jobs and that unemployment had grown so massively at the time. And you talking to some people, one of the things that sort of struck you immediately was everyone was just perplexed how it was that banks and bank CEOs as well as corporate CEOs were still making millions of dollars, and yet at the same time millions of people had been thrown out of work. And no one could understand how this contradiction was continuing to taking place, and at the same time, why was it that the banks themselves were being bailed out, but yet very little was being offered in some cases for those who were unemployed, and that much of, in terms of retrospect, that kind of feeling has exactly been taking place because of how the financial crisis has been handled by many of the major industrial powers, is that it's been primarily directed towards saving banks, but very little that's been directed towards helping everyday workers, and certainly nothing at all in terms of trying to protect employment and trying to protect good jobs and unionized jobs. Much of the emphasis now in Western Europe has been towards labor market deregulation as well as saving banks as the key sorts of solutions to the crisis. But I think in sort of talking to people, it was not only why they were so perplexed about this sort of uneven balance of how governments were responding to the financial crisis, but at the same time talking to people, about how, as you began to realize what some of the salaries were for some of these CEOs and some of the wages in the financial sector, If you looked at even in Western Europe, it was often the case that if you're a hedge fund manager, you could be earning upwards of $200 to $300 million a year. And that some of the top hedge fund managers, even in Western Europe, are approaching close to 500 million euro, and in New York they're approaching close to $1 billion US on an annual basis. And when people began to sort of talk about this and say, well, how is it that we have an economy that's so tremendously unbalanced, that this is at the same time that we're having to bail out and continue to maintain this economy, many of the people who were protesting were saying, we need a completely different economy. We need a completely different kind of alternative model, and we need a very different kind of government and democracy if we're going to deal with that. And I think, if nothing else, I think the Occupy movement really brought out this idea that it wasn't just about finance at the end of it, it was also about having a different kind of democracy and a different kind of world. This is for everything from environmental sustainability to gender equality to different kinds of public services, and in many cases, especially in Spain, what the kids who are arguing for were more democratic and more direct democracy institutions if possible. And this is at all kinds of levels, and especially in terms of dealing and addressing the public policy around finance and the financial sector. And I think that if one of the things that many people realized was that finance, at least to them and seemingly to me as well, and I think to many people, is that finance had grown out of proportion to everything else. And that those who were in the financial sector were taking advantage of their financial power and using that economic power as a way of buttressing and continuing to improve and strengthen their financial control and their financial gains and economic gains from the overall global economy. And I think that you throw out some of these numbers and you sort of say, well, how large is the financial sector? Well, Gerard Dumenel and Dominic Levy have produced some numbers. I don't know how accurate they are. But they certainly are sort of mind-boggling, and they seem to be the sort of best guesstimates that I've seen, just in terms of sort of global financial assets that are available. And they're talking about trillions of dollars that have emerged just within the space of 20 years, and much of their data shows that this massive expansion of financial power and financial assets has in many cases risen fivefold, or in some cases, especially for pension funds, more than tenfold. In terms of the size and power and strength of these kinds of assets, and that they're being used on a daily basis. And of course, at the same time, the industries and the pension funds and the mutual funds and the investment banks themselves are all taking huge bonuses and salaries and fees in any kind of transaction that involves any of these new financial assets that have been created over the past 20 to 30 years. And so I think that people were rightly outraged, and still are rightly outraged. And I think that one of the things that's interesting is that people don't realize how large some of these salaries are when they talk about those who are wealthy. In terms of many of the kinds of survey research, at least in the United States, people are asked, what do you think the average CEO makes? Well, interestingly enough, people often think it's something less than $1 million a year. But yet the average CEO salary now in the United States approaches $25 million a year, right? So people have no real sort of connection. They understand that they're making huge sums, but there's no real sort of connection that's taking place. And I think that if the other thing that really sort of began to make people stand up and take notice was, and interestingly enough, the comedians who began to talk about, if there was an academic it was public leading academics in some ways, I think it's true, is that in terms of comedians, John Bird and John Fortune, I don't know if anyone has seen the video, but it's great about trying to explain the origins of the financial crisis. And they talk very clearly to say, well, they've taken some dodgy debt, often from those who are very poor and have mortgages. They've turned it around, and they've made it into something that's called a structured investment vehicle, or a high structured investment vehicle. And they go, well, what's the importance of this thing? Well, it has a very good name. And why would anyone buy this? Well, can't go wrong if it sounds, it's high grade, it's structured, it's something that's bound to be good, and then it's sold on. And they go, well, how is it that someone's debt has been turned into a financial asset? And he goes, well, that's the magic of the market. And I think that that's the thing that many people still have to sort of pause and think about. How is it that all of these different kinds of debts, everyone can now see that it was in the United States, it was mortgage debt, and the fact that mortgage default was crucial, but only in the sense that because those mortgages defaulted there, it created other kind of widespread problem. Well, it wasn't just that kind of problem. It was the fact that that mortgage debt was turned into a financial asset that then was sold on multiple times to other kinds of banks, other kinds of corporations, and then used multiple times again as for banks themselves to sell on more kinds of debt and more kinds of debt-backed kinds of assets. And I think if there's one key characteristic of financialization that I think is important, is to realize that what has happened over the past 20 years is that through investment banking and through deregulation, the financial sector has been able to take all kinds of debt, from mortgages to corporate bonds to commercial paper to any kinds of consumer credit, and to transform that into a financial asset that can be broken up and sold on multiple times. And moreover, once that asset is sold and held by someone, they too can take that asset and use it themselves to leverage more debt and to leverage more financing. Okay? Typically as ways for driving up stock prices, in other cases for buying new kinds of companies, or in other cases for actually the expansion of financial services or the expansion of multinational corporations around the world. And I think that's the most amazing thing about what has happened, in a sense, is that how debt has been used, and in many cases it's the debt of citizens and workers, has been used as a way and a tool of expanding corporate power and expanding financial power. And I think that's the sort of key thing that's often left out, because it's not just about that mortgages have been used in some sort of magic, but it's actually the fact that it's people's housing. That in the old days, where a bank used to hold on to a mortgage and then you would pay that mortgage over time. Well, that's no longer what happens. You buy a mortgage, the bank immediately takes that and sells it on to a market and turns and sells it on into a secondary market. But in doing so, it's not just that expands the nature of debt, it also is a way of expanding financial power and new kinds of financial assets, especially for the financial sector, but also for multinational corporations. So, in terms of my understanding of financialization, I think that's the sort of first thing, and I think that's what really is interesting, is that how much debt then expands across all OECD countries. And that one of the things globalization is often talked about is that it's an external force, that it's a force that imposes itself on countries. But in many ways, what globalization, especially financialization, is about internal forces. It's about the transformation of internal economies and the transformations of the internal financial sector. And debt is crucial to that, because for the financial sector, where we think about debt as something that we have to pay back, for finance and for business, finance and debt is now about a new asset that they can use to leverage, okay, greater kinds of control and greater kinds of profit. And I think that's really sort of important about understanding the first characteristic about this big word that we now use, financialization, has been the transformation of debt into finance, and to how finance can then use that to expand its corporate power, but also to expand the profits that are going upwards to those who run the funds and run banks and corporate and financial institutions. And it's interesting that in almost all these cases, how debt has, in many cases we talk about debt, it's always been about household debt, and that's the big major concern. But as you can see from this, private sector debt is often much higher than household debt, in some cases twice as much as household debt. But yet there's no discussion about private sector debt being the major, or a major fear or a major problem. But yet, in terms of what's continuing to happen, even after the financial crisis, there's been very few kinds of reforms and changes in terms of the leverage ratios for either banks or for corporations themselves. And yet the debt and the kinds of finance that they're using is continuing to climb, continuing to be used very extensively. And as a consequence, now we see that debt levels are in some countries, Japan is one of the greatest exceptions, and is that it's at over 450% of its annual GDP. Belgium, Portugal, and Spain are all over 350%, but for the majority of countries now, if we add up all of the debt, Okay? It's not about government and household debt oftentimes, it's corporate and private sector debt, which is much higher and now leads almost all countries to have levels of indebtedness of over 300% of their annual GDP. So that's one of the first things that I think I'd like to sort of highlight in terms of trying to understand financialization, is this new role of debt. The second thing I think is, and that's why I was very interested that Kevin invited me, and I think that it's important to have the discussion, is that financialization has also been about mobilizing pension funds. Okay? Because along with debt, the other key part of financialization has been about mobilizing savings. And the biggest part of savings that have been mobilized, okay, has been through the use of pension funds. And pension funds have also been crucial, because pension funds themselves can also be parsed into all kinds of these new financial assets, whether that's asset-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations. And as a consequence, by taking, say, $1 of a pension fund, that can suddenly become over $25 of a financial asset that can be used by the financial sector. And it can be used to buy corporate equity, it can be used in money markets, and it can be used in all kinds of ways by corporations themselves to buy back stock and to grow their own companies. And I think that's really another sort of key aspect that we've seen take place. And certainly the kinds of play and the size of pension funds has also become much more important for stock markets and for corporations themselves. And that's another sort of key aspect that's taking place. It's not just the fact that pension funds can be used as a new financial asset, it's also that the major and the large pension funds and mutual funds and asset managers are also playing much larger roles on stock markets. And that's a third key aspect now of financialization, is that how large these what are called institutional investors are on stock markets. They've taken on an entirely new role in terms of their pressures on general stock markets as well as on corporate performance. So this is the third big aspect, I think, of financialization, is these new roles of pension funds. Pension funds themselves are under a fiduciary duty to produce returns. And they're doing that by turning over stock as fast as possible in many of the new kinds of stock exchanges if they can. And I think that's one of the other big component parts. Pension funds used to be invested primarily in government bonds and treasury bills. Now they're being increasingly invested in things like equities, in stock, in corporate bonds, in all these different sorts of ways. Now, I'm going to quickly run out of time here, but here's the sort of you can see that here as a demonstration that for Canada, we see the increasing, and dominant role from 30% in terms of the public equity. We see institutional investors hold around 40% of all public equity now in Canada. Now, so we often think about financialization as just having an impact on the financial sector itself. But I think as Sam and as Leo and as other scholars like Greta Krippner, William Milberg, finance has also affected how corporations themselves have changed. And this is a bit of an idealized way of sort of thinking about the transformations from a traditional kind of corporation and how it operated to what's called shareholder capitalism. But certainly you can see these kinds of major transformations have taken place in terms of how corporations themselves begin to manage. Because with the rise of finance and the availability of different kinds of finance, corporations themselves have also began to take advantage of new financial assets. And in many cases, what you're seeing now is that things in terms of their finance and their portfolio income, those are taking on a much greater role in terms of their profitability and in terms of their strategy for driving new kinds of profit. At the same time, they're using that kind of finance as a way of for what are called share buybacks. If you build up the shares in your company, you can pay yourself more compensation and greater kinds of compensation. At the same time, you see much greater interest in terms of money markets, new kinds of finance. They don't have to go to banks. They can go into all kinds of different money markets and financial markets for finance. CEOs themselves now focus and have only parts of their salary being paid on the basis of salary. It's now about corporate performance, and stock performance is key, right? And then lastly, of course, in terms of the stock ownership, once you build up the size of your company, what's called market capitalization, you're under increased pressure all the time to make sure that you meet profit returns and profit expectations. And then as there's a continuous churn between different kinds of stock, those companies are continuing under new kinds of financial pressure to realize and expand profits. And I think that's another sort of key aspect here as well. And here you can see, in terms of the transformations of firm finance, I'm not going to go into it, but already, with a few exceptions of Austria, Germany, and Norway, almost the major trend now is for firms, in terms of their financing, are to use bond markets, share markets, and private equity markets. Although this was only in 2003, but by 2005, the average is much, much higher in terms of how firms are using and using new kinds of means of finance. And in terms of corporate operation, I don't have much time, but I do want to show that it's a pretty widespread trend, and it's a pretty common trend across all of the OECD countries, the major industrial countries. Almost all, in terms of firms and in terms of stock markets, all of them see common trends of firm size growing to almost 100% or 120% of GDP in the space of about 17 years. In almost all countries, you see the expansion of stock markets that, on an annual basis, that they're much larger than the annual GDP. And at the same time, they're taking that, they're using new kinds of the profits that are in their portfolio incomes from financial activities are driving new foreign direct investment around the world, and especially as a way of trying to buy new kinds of subsidiaries in a number of parts of the world. So what does this mean then in terms of actual outcomes? Well, one outcome, of course, is that the new financialization of the world economy means that those who are at the top of it are seeing most of the returns, if not all of the returns. The top one, this is for Canada from 1990 to 2008. This is average salaries of the top of the median income earners, the top 1% and the richest 0.01% of income earners. Well, you can see just in terms of average income, those who are in the top 0.01% of income earners for their wages only have expanded from 800,000 to 1.8 million on an average basis, right? At the same time, average wages for median family income have remained right around $55,000 to $57,000 a year over the past 18-year period. Okay? And you go, well, how is this happening? Well, in terms of the share of total income that's been captured by the top 1% and the top 10%, most of it has been going to the very elite and the most affluent in all of our societies. And this has been especially the case and most aggravated and most noticeable in the United States, in Canada. In Canada, about 38% of all income between 1980 and 2008 was captured by the top 1% of income earners. As part of the top 10%, it moves another roughly 30%, so in total it's almost 65% of all income growth was captured by the top 10% of all income earners over the space from 1980 to 2008. Only the United States had a worse or more unequal distribution of income growth. Okay? And interestingly enough, if you compare, it's not all countries. In Denmark, 90%, those who are in the bottom 90% of income earners, still saw a completely equitable distribution of income, receiving 90% of all income, okay, within inside their national economies. So, but the general trend, certainly for financialization, is for those who are rich to have become richer over this time period. And then lastly, I want to point out one of the things that's also key to financialization has been the remake and the makeover, okay, of how corporations work. Certainly one of the major transformations for globalization has been an increase in capital, okay? But at the same time that that's taken place in terms of manufacturing and the spread of intermediate manufacturing around the world, roughly 50% of intermediate components are now traded inter-firm and on a global basis for manufacturing, which means that through global value change and the expansion of global corporations, that they're using new kinds of networks, right, okay, for production, For the industrial economies, this means a major loss of manufacturing employment, and it typically means a major loss of private sector union density and very good jobs, right? Okay? And at the same time that that's taken place, corporations are also using more part-time employment, more temporary employment, more contracted out employment, and they're certainly trying to find new ways to two-tier collective agreements as quickly as possible. And this means more low-wage work, more and fewer benefits for those who are newly hired into unionized jobs as well. And we can see that this has been a common trend in terms of what's called cheap labor across the rich industrial democracies. Now, here's a great little sign from one of the protesters from the Occupy movement in New York, and he's saying that they woke up. And it would be nice to say that more people are waking up, but certainly what Occupy did, I think, was to bring to the fore this idea that something was seriously wrong with the global economy, and that something was seriously wrong with finance, and that something was seriously wrong with governments that continue to support the financial sector at the cost of all other workers and most of the citizens. And that unless we make changes, and this makes in terms of making changes, that's to the pension plans so that they don't invest in asset-backed kinds of securities, that we make changes in terms of how debt is used or not used so that we can see new kinds of restrictions on the ways that financial securities are bought and sold. And unless we see and need to really begin to make a real push for new kinds of public ownership of finance, I think it's going to be very difficult, okay, to move beyond the current contradictions and the current problems and the current strengths that finance has over many of us. But if we begin to understand that finance is not simply about creating jobs, but actually about creating a maldistribution of income, about making sure that those who are most powerful are getting more powerful, and that those who are at the top 1% of income earners, are seeing the most benefits from financialization. If we begin to realize that, we can begin to make demands that we need some kind of significant kind of change. Thanks very much.